Good morning. My name is Carol Kain. Ordinarily, I would be saying, welcome to our museum. Given the current situation, I am welcoming you to a virtual museum, which today happens to be in my living room. In addition to being a docent, I am also a 2G or second generation speaker. This means that although I did not personally experience the Holocaust, virtually all of my family did. Since they are no longer alive to tell their stories, I would like to share them with you today. I was born during the cataclysm that was World War II, a few weeks after D-Day. So those of you who know your history will be able to figure out how old I am. The war had been raging for almost 5 years by then. Millions of people had suffered and died. Soldiers killed in battle, civilians dying of disease, starvation, or being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and various ethnic, religious, and political groups that were being systematically, vigorously, and effectively annihilated because of what they thought, what they believed, or simply who they were. So that's the world into which I was born. But I was safe. Even though the war in Europe would not end for 10 months after my birth, I was born in America, only the second person in my family to have that privilege. And so I was safe from what was going on across the ocean, from hunger and cold and homelessness, from being hunted down, from being alone in the world, from going to heaven in a cloud of reeking smoke. It was because of all the other members of my family who were brave, who took risks, who got lucky, who suffered terribly, and who were massacred, that I am here today to tell you their stories. Most of my family came from extreme northwestern Germany, just about an hour from the Dutch border, in a small town called Aurich. Next slide, please. Sierra? Okay, thanks. The families of my paternal grandfather and maternal grandmother had lived in Aurich just about forever. The maternal side, the Hoffmans, had been there for well over 100 years. But my father's side could be traced back to 1739 at the very least. All of my family were merchants. Next slide, please. My mother's father, Karl Gadansky, was not prosperous, but made a living in a small tobacco shop on the main market square. This is a picture of my grandparents, Karl and Gertrude Gadansky. This was their engagement picture. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the big market square. Next slide, please. That's my grandmother, that's my grandfather in later years, and that building right behind the tree is their shop with their apartment on the top floor. He made a living in this little tobacco shop. Next slide, please. This is a picture of my other grandfather, Lippmann Noor. And the other picture is a picture of his store, which was exactly kitty-cornered from the tobacco shop. It was a small version of what today we would call a department store. And they had, over the centuries, become quite well-to-do. Like many shop owners still do in Europe, both families lived in apartments over their shops. Unlike many of the Jews in Eastern Europe, the Jews in Germany were fairly well assimilated. They were just a small percentage of the population, about 500,000 Jews to 67 million people living in Germany. In Aurich at the time, there were about 400 Jews in a population of 5,000. They were allowed, indeed required, to attend the public schools and were allowed to practice just about any career or profession they chose. They lived among their Christian neighbors, dressed like them, had friends and customers who were not Jewish. My parents went to the public schools through high school. In their town, there was always a sense of otherness, but it was their home. They thought of themselves as German. Next slide, please. And my grandfather Karl fought for the Kaiser, the German emperor, in World War I. But unlike many German Jews, these families were not assimilated religiously. They remained deeply observant Jews who went to synagogue regularly, kept strictly kosher, and observed their faith in the old-fashioned ways while remaining part of the larger community. Next slide. My father, Herman Noor, was born in 1908, the fourth of 5 siblings. Herman and his brothers were brought up to be merchants like the rest of the family. My father really would have liked to go to university and become an economist or a lawyer. But his father, Lippmann, did not believe in higher education and insisted that all the boys be prepared to take over the family business. And apparently he was a man with one whom did not disagree. Next slide, please. This is my mother, Mary Gadansky, who was born in 1911. She had one brother, Eric, who was 3 years younger. Like my father, she graduated from high school, helped out in the family store, and socialized, mostly with her Jewish friends and cousins. She was a self-admitted clothes horse. The back of this picture is labeled a Paris gown. I believe she had thought to become a dentist, but family finances did not allow for that kind of schooling, and the Nazis would have prevented this anyhow. My parents knew each other all their lives and eventually became sweethearts, despite the fact that she teased him mercilessly about his buck teeth. They wanted to get married, but this was vigorously opposed by Grandpa Lippmann, who was apparently a major snob. He objected to the union on the basis, firstly, that Mother's family was not of the right socioeconomic level, and that her father was not German, he was Lithuanian, and so she was not of acceptable status on that count either. When Hitler came to power in 1933, my parents were in their early 20s. As the Nazis ramped up their methods for making life progressively more difficult for the Jews and other groups they hated, Grandpa Lippmann declared that he was just as German as they were, that the Nazis would never actually harm him or his family, and that they were going nowhere. On the other hand, Lippmann's daughter, Leah, had married another wealthy Jewish merchant named Eric Sternberg, and they woke up and smelled the coffee way earlier. They realized that things were going to get worse, not better, and began to make plans to emigrate. As early as 1935, Eric began to legally withdraw certain amounts of his savings. One family story says he went across to Holland a number of times and bought unset jewels and brought them back to Aue. He did this several times. That is a fact. I now hear that he also probably sent some of his money to relatives in New York who banked it for him so it would be there when he needed it. One night, late in 1935, he and his wife pulled the shades and sat by candlelight sewing the gems into the lining of his clothing. He was able to get a visa to America because he had the money, and he had a brother living in Mississippi who was his sponsor, meaning he promised the American government that if Eric couldn't make it on his own, the brother would take care of him and the government wouldn't be bothered. Eric came to the United States early in 1936, sold the jewels, probably took the money out of the bank, and started looking for a business to buy. His wife, Leah, stayed in Aulich with her 3 small children, one of whom was beaten up at school several times for being a Jew, and another who almost died of appendicitis because no hospital would admit her. It took almost a year, but Eric found a department store to buy in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He bought it and a house, and he then wrote to Leah in a code they had devised before he left. When she read, "The shirts have been delivered," she packed up the kids and all their belongings, and they arrived at the very end of 1936. One of my father's brothers, Eric Noor, was living in Aulich with his family, who was his wife, Melanie, and his small son, Werner. Eric was working in the store, and like his father, was not yet thinking of leaving. But my Aunt Melanie had become very frightened and aware of what was going on and what was likely to happen. And she began pushing Eric to think of emigrating to the US. After a while, he apparently said, okay, he would go and send and get established and send for them. But Aunt Melanie insisted that she would not agree to that. Either they would all go together or they would not go at all, because she was pretty sure in her mind that if he left alone, they would never see each other again. So finally, in the fall of 1938, Eric, Melanie, and Werner, who was then 2 years old, left for America just before Kristallnacht. At this time, my mother's family, the Gadanskys, knew they didn't have the resources to flee, even if they could manage to do it. My grandfather, Carl, was already terminally ill. He was not allowed to seek medical care from a non-Jewish doctor or a non-Jewish hospital, and there weren't any Jewish ones. He died in 1936. This left my mother and my grandmother, Trude, to keep up the store and try to survive. By the time of Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass in November 1938, that was still the status quo. My parents, their surviving parents, and most of their siblings were living at home, trying to navigate the increasingly stormy environment. But for them, like for so many others, Kristallnacht was the turning point, convincing them that things were going to get worse, probably much worse, and that it would be wise to try to escape. Except, that is, for Grandpa Liepman, who still declared that he was as German as anyone and was thus safe and was not going anywhere. Remember Grandpa Liepman. I'm not completely sure what happened to my mother on Kristallnacht. Next slide, please. I believe she was out in the town when the Nazis began to burn, pillage, and attack Jewish stores, synagogues, and people. This is a marker that the town subsequently put up that stands where the burned synagogue had stood for hundreds of years. She was running, trying to get home. She was pushed down to the street several times, but she got home. Next slide, please. A month later, she got this letter from the Nazi government. It is untruthfully labeled birth certificate. What it's really doing is telling her that henceforth, her middle name will not be Teresa, but Sarah. This was a step the Nazis undertook to better control the Jewish population, make them more identifiable. All Jewish men and boys had to take the middle name Israel, all women and girls, Sarah. Around that time, the home and shop that she and her mother were living in and trying to maintain on their own were taken by the people who ran the business next to theirs. This is one of the stories where there's two somewhat divergent versions. One is that the owner of the store next door simply showed up, knocked on the door, and said, "I'm giving you X amount of time to get out of here, and then you're gone," and that he never paid her a red cent. The other version is that she put the house on the market knowing they would have to leave, that the owner next door offered to buy it and actually did pay her a token amount of money. But then when my grandmother left Germany, the Nazi government confiscated every penny she'd been given. So in effect, they never received a penny for their property. A few months later, in early 1939, my mother was able to come to America, where she stayed with relatives, waiting for the others to join her. Her mother came a year later on one of the last boats allowed to leave. For my father, Kristallnacht was more momentous. Shortly after Kristallnacht, he and one of his brothers were included in the Nazi roundup of 30,000 Jewish men and boys who for the first time were taken to concentration camps. My father and Harry, his oldest brother, were taken to the Sachsenhausen camp near Berlin. They spent a number of miserable weeks there. The Nazis had already confiscated most of the family's wealth and belongings, but the family was able to scrape together enough to buy them out of the camp and to get them visas for England. Early in 1939, my father, Harry, and Harry's family went to England, where they stayed for a year until they were able to come to the United States. This was not a happy time for them. My father and uncle did not speak English. They were never able to get a job. My uncle was actually interned for a while as an enemy alien by the British. And my father always told the story that he could never go back to England because when he left, they stamped his passport undesirable alien. So by 1941, my parents and my grandmother, along with a number of uncles, aunts, and cousins, were safe in the United States. My parents married here in Chicago, and then they moved to Baton Rouge, where the uncle with the jewels in his coat had jobs for them in the business he had bought. Several other relatives followed for the same reason. With my parents was my grandmother, who lived with them the rest of her life. But what of the ones who had not made it out? Remember Grandfather Liebman, who was more German than anyone? By 1941, he was alone in Germany. All his kids and grandkids were in America and had been begging him to let them try to get him to the United States, but he refused for a long time. Finally, sometime in 1941, old, frail, and alone, he agreed to emigrate if it could be arranged. The family moved heaven and earth to try to bring him over, but he had waited too long. In January 1942, he was riding on a streetcar when some Nazis got on. For some reason, possibly just as a prank, they took hold of the old little Jew and threw him off. He landed on the tracks, and the streetcar ran over his leg, severing it. A short time later, he died. Next slide, please. This is my great-grandfather, who was the head of an enormous family who lived in Lithuania. When Hitler came to power, my mother's brother, Eric, was sent there to live with the family because it was thought to be safe in Lithuania. But then Lithuania was taken over by the Nazis, and that entire huge family was arrested. Almost all of them eventually died. We don't know if they died in the concentration camps, or in the ghettos, or in the mass shootings in the forests of Lithuania. No one in the family who is still alive knows the answer. But my uncle Eric somehow wound up in a string of concentration camps until he finally wound up in Dachau in southern Germany. He stayed there until liberation in 1945. He said he survived only because he was relatively young and because he was put to work in a kind of kitchen or infirmary where he got slightly more food and was more protected from the elements. When he was liberated at the end of the war, he was sent to the hospital at a displaced persons camp. While he was there, he was visited by a Red Cross worker who said, "I can help you contact your family." He assumed that his mother and sister, Mary and Truda, had died. So he had the Red Cross worker write to his aunt in Pittsburgh. The aunt wrote back and said, "Did you know that your mother and sister are alive and well in Baton Rouge, Louisiana?" They assumed he had died. He assumed they had died. But in June, next slide, please. But in June 1946, he was able to come to Louisiana. That's me in my cuter days sitting on my uncle's lap right after he came over from Europe. His family still has that letter from the Red Cross worker letting them know that he was alive. And it was in Baton Rouge where he met his wife, Trudy. She was also a survivor. She lived in a small town in Holland with her parents and her first husband when the Nazis took over the Netherlands. One day she came home to find no one there. The Nazis had taken her parents and her husband and sent them first to Westerbork, a transit camp in Holland, and ultimately to the death camp, Auschwitz, where they were all murdered. Initially, Trudy was hidden by a farmer for several months, but then he became afraid and told her she had to leave. Soon thereafter, she was taken by the Nazis and also sent to Westerbork. From there, she was sent to another concentration camp, Theresienstadt near Prague, where she was kept until liberation, doing labor in a factory. After liberation, she wandered Europe for a while, trying to find her parents and husband. One day she was reading the paper and she saw a personal ad. It said that if you could prove you were related to the placer of the ad, he would help you to emigrate to the United States. She recognized the name as her mother's cousin, who did indeed arrange for her to come to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, because the guy who placed the ad was the uncle with the jewels in his coat, who was using his prosperity to help any family he could reach. And that met. Next slide. Whoops, went too fast. All the relatives who had the brains, the bravery, and the luck to get out lived long, prosperous lives in America. This is my mom and dad, probably in the 1960s, looking, I think, happy and prosperous. They married, raised families, and became solid, well-respected members of their local and religious communities. Were they sometimes homesick? Of course. Did they struggle to make their way in a different world, in a new language? Yes. Did they have to change some of their ways, like religious observance? Certainly. But they were always proud to be Americans and always saw the United States as a wonderful place, a safe haven for them and their families, a land of opportunity. But was it over for them? The Nazis had been soundly defeated. The Germans paid for what had happened in many different ways. Germany became one of America's strongest allies. But my family never forgot what they and the ones who did not make it had undergone. Several of my uncles forbade that German be spoken in the homes. They tried to give the children born here American-sounding names. For the rest of her long life, my grandmother often woke up in the middle of the night screaming that the Nazis were at the door. My father never forgave. He worked for years to get reparations for our family and others. He refused to spend a penny for any German goods or services. He was persuaded to go back only once, but refused to spend even one night on German soil, leaving Holland only long enough to visit the town and the cemetery. And so it was over for me, or was it? Did I ever personally experience anti-Semitism? Not that I'm aware of. Maybe it was there and I missed it, but I do not recall ever feeling it personally. Don't forget, I grew up in the Deep South in a very tiny Jewish community at a time when racial prejudice and hatred were focused on African Americans, not Jews. I went to strictly segregated schools all the way through high school. I never met or played with or went to school with a Black child. I never had a Black teacher or nurse or doctor or sales clerk. The only African Americans with whom I had contact were working class adults, house cleaners, laborers, and the like. Neither did my parents ever have the opportunity to meet Black people on a level playing field. My parents spoke very angrily about their former friends and neighbors in Germany, the schoolmates, teachers, and others who either shunned them after the Nazis took power or who took more direct action against them. They expressed disbelief that these people who had always been part of their lives would not ignore the edicts, would not try to intercede. But I never knew my parents, who were aware of the flight of their Black fellow townspeople in Baton Rouge. One in the 90s, my mother made a very meek rebuttal to some open remarks being made in her office and was shunned for weeks by her co-workers. She may have been lucky that it never came to more than that. So now the shoe was on the other foot. They were at least somewhat aware of the injustices experienced by the Black community of that time and place, but not unlike the German people, they seldom or never risked their own situation to try to help. And they were never able to understand this parallel. In 1992, my husband and I, with my mother, other relatives, and former residents of Aurich, went back for a reunion sponsored by the local government. Aurich is a lovely town, the kind tourists go looking for, old, scenic, with plenty of beer gardens. It was a well-arranged and warm reception for most of them. But the owner of the hotel where many of us stayed was openly hostile. A restaurant seated a large group of us for dinner, but we were never waited on or served. Visiting Jews who asked passersby to take a photo of their group were ignored or evaded. And on one wall, there was some brand new anti-Semitic graffiti. Excuse me. These are not things unheard of even today, even in America. When our museum was dedicated in 2009, there were dignitaries inside, but down the street was a band of uniformed American neo-Nazis. No, it is not over. Will it ever be? In Jewish tradition, immortality exists in memory. Those who have passed into eternity go on in the memories of those who think of them, who picture them, who tell their stories. For that moment, that time when they are remembered, they live again. And so I thank you for your attention, your interest, and for giving me the chance to have them briefly here again. My parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles, who all in their various ways defied the Nazis and paved the way through their bravery and perseverance so that I was safe. Thank you all for being here to share this with me and with mine. Thank you again for tuning in. Join us next Wednesday, December 9th at 10 a.m. to hear speaker Cheryl Teitelbaum share her family's story of survival. Please keep an eye on Illinois Holocaust Museum's Facebook and other social media accounts where we will post a stream of content through the weeks ahead. Thank you for your support during this extraordinary time. Are there any questions?
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your story. We do have some questions. Let's see. First one, when did your family first start telling you their story?
They spoke of it as, I think, all my life. We were part of there was a lot of family and close friends who were survivors living in Baton Rouge. And when they got together, the topic came up fairly frequently. So for as long as I can remember, I heard little tidbits here and there.
Okay, and then when did you then start kind of sharing their story? When did you get involved with the museum?
I got involved with the museum I did my training in 2011 and became a docent, and I've been doing it ever since.
Let's see. What was it like for you growing up as a child of survivors?
It was not so much as a child of survivors, other than my grandmother's nightmares and waking the whole family up. It was more of being an unassimilated Jew living in a small southern town. I was the only one who couldn't be a Brownie or Girl Scout because it met the same day as Hebrew school. If I was invited to a weenie roast, I had to bring my own kosher hot dogs, which does not sit well with kids. I got made fun of a lot. And the fact that my parents spoke with an accent made me stick out like a sore thumb too.
The next question we have, you mentioned the department store in Baton Rouge. What happened with that? Is it still in the family?
Oh, it grew like topsy. It grew and grew and grew. My uncle, the man with the jewels in his coat, was an extraordinary businessman. And he expanded and expanded, and eventually they became, I think, the third largest or the largest family-owned department store in the country. But then my uncle died and his older son died, and it just got to be too much, and the remaining family sold it a number of years ago.
It's amazing though. One last question I'm seeing right now. What message or takeaway do you want people to have from hearing your family story?
I want people not to forget what happened. I want people not to forget how horrific it was, what was lost, what was done to people, and that it is not over there. I mean, if one looks at the news today, here in America and across Europe, certainly there are apparently uprisings of neo-Nazism. As I said at the end, it is not over. I don't know if it will ever be over. And I think one needs to be fully aware of that all the time.
Very much so. Thank you so much. I will let you say goodbye real quick, however you want.
Thank you all for tuning in, and don't forget next week and all the other presentations, and I appreciate your listening.